Welcome everyone to this joint webinar of Child Hub and the Promise Project. First of all, can you hear me well? Could you please write in the chat box? Great, thank you. I'm Judit Németh-Almási, the project coordinator of the Child Hub project. This is, as I said, a joint webinar with Promise, and this is in fact the third of a mini-series of 3 webinars on health in the Barnahus. The webinar is being recorded and will be available together with the PowerPoint right after the webinar. In order to hear us, just make sure that the speaker icon on top black bar stays green. While you don't have access to your mic, you can always write in the chat box, and in fact we encourage you to use it if you have comments or questions, and if you have technical difficulties, we'll try to help you. Sometimes internet has strange ways of making our webinars difficult, so I cannot promise everything, but we'll try to help you. Without further ado, let me give the floor to Shauna from the Council of Baltic States.
Thank you so much, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Shauna Lomdiksen, and as you just said, I am from the Council of the Baltic Sea States, and we are the lead partner on a project called Promise. And I notice a lot of familiar names in the list here, so I won't do as much of my usual spiel as I usually do. Suffice to say, I will once again show the model of what a Barnahus looks like. Just to once again emphasize that it is a one-stop shop, that these professional groups do physically meet literally under one roof in the same place to coordinate their work, to investigate and provide support to child victims of violence, and that it is important to have a medical evaluation as part of the regular routines, not only for recording physical evidence when it is possible to do so, but also because it is a crucial component of the healing that needs to happen, be it physical and also mental. So we are in phase 2, as you probably already know, and Promise and Barnahus is famous. We last week held a big conference here in Stockholm on a totally different issue, on corporal punishment actually, and it came up time and time again from Marta Santos-Pace, the Special Representative on Violence Against Children, and we had Anna Maria Carrasco-Bilt, who is an MEP, and many others regularly brought it up as a good practice model that should be everywhere throughout Europe, and we're really glad to see it spreading so quickly and to be a part of that. You're probably already familiar with our publications from the first phase of the project. The hero publication here is the Barnahus Quality Standards. It comes in many different flavors. It has a long version, a short version, an ebook, and the short version has also been translated into a number of languages, and more are coming soon. And you can find them on our website. And the website you'll find, if you just go down here, there's a web link, more about Promise. And that's all I've got. So now I'm going to introduce the webinar. So today we have our featured speaker of Andrea Goddard, who is consultant pediatrician and pediatric lead at the Havens, the Sexual Assault Referral Center, King's College Hospital, NHS Fundation Trust in London, the United Kingdom. And this is part 3 of a 3-part series on medical evaluation. This part is about sexual abuse, diagnostic workup, and decision making. You can already watch the first 2 parts. The first one was with Stefan Rune from Karolinska University Hospital in Sweden, and this gave a framework for our discussions. And then the second part was on physical abuse, diagnostic workup, and decision making. This was with Resmia Oral from the United States. And Stefan may or may not be joining us later on to give comments and to participate in the question and answer portion. He has written that he does plan to join if he has the opportunity. But until then, we pass it on to Andrea. You can turn on your microphone and your camera. And please, we're so looking forward to your presentation today.
Right. Okay, so can everyone hear me? I see, yes. Oh, great. Okay, so welcome everyone. It's great to be here. What I'm talking about, following on from Stefan and Rosemary, is the medical evaluation when either a child discloses or when there are concerns around sexual abuse. I'm just going to start off telling you a little bit about me. I work this. So, as Shana said, I'm a pediatrician in a hospital pediatrician in a big hospital in London, which is this one called St Mary's. It used to be famous as a place where penicillin was invented, but recently it's become much more famous as the place where the royal babies are born, and every time that happens we have a big press presence outside our hospital. The service I work in relation to children and young people who've been sexually assaulted or abused is part of King's College Hospital, which is another big old hospital in London. It hosts a service called the Havens. The Havens have a couple of functions. First of all, they're the 24-hour, 365-day-a-year acute forensic medical centre for anyone, any age, any gender who wants or needs an examination after a sexual assault. But as well as that, they've got lots of other services in relation to follow-up medical services, psychological services, advocacy, and they're actually jointly funded and commissioned by both the health service and the police service. So it's already a joint service. In terms of the Barnahus influence in London, we were able, with a lot of help from our friends in Promise One, in fact, that really helped us influence the direction of an enhanced service we were able to open for children and young people about 2.5 years ago, and we covered the whole of London. The new exciting development is a non-acute service for children covering about 20% of London, but we are hoping to see that rolled out so that there is additional services for children all over London, which, as you may have noted, is rather big and very complicated, with about 8 million people and lots of people from very diverse backgrounds. So now I'm going to move on to the first poll, which is about whether or not you've visited London. I know I can already see a person in the audience who might even live in London, but I was just curious to know how many people have. And then London has this possibly unwarranted reputation for having terrible weather, although today it's living up to it. So occasionally it is really nice and sunny. Good, someone was here when it was sunny. Most people think it's permanently cold and raining, which unfortunately it is today. So that's just to get you into the mood for polling. I don't know if we're finished. Looks like we might be. Okay, so that's enough about me and enough about London. And we'll just move on. So what I'm going to talk about today, this is the outline, and it's all about either disclosure of abuse or assault, and throughout, so I don't have to keep saying that, I'm going to say CYP and sexual assault. Sometimes, especially in children who are non-verbal or pre-verbal, we're not sure, but we're concerned, so that's why there's either disclosure or concerns. So what I'm particularly going to talk about are those 4 things. So how we plan a medical evaluation, what we do in a medical evaluation, what we do afterwards, and just 2 other hot topics if I get time at the end. Right. So this is where I had to think very carefully about this presentation. I didn't want it to be too medical and technical. And we've had a discussion just beforehand, and just as a health warning, there's only one line drawing that shows any detailed anatomy in this whole presentation that I'm going to skip past quite quickly. The rest of it, I hope, is not too distressing. It's mainly to describe what we do and how we do it and why we do it. At the end, though, I've got 2 pages of references, so that if you work in a more specialized health area particularly, and you need to have more detailed information, then the references at the end should be quite helpful and lead you to other sources of information at the same time. So I can see that, in fact, there is a doctor here, and lots of other people. And someone's going to let me know what the NGO is. And Shana is describing herself as a bureaucrat. Okay. So I think that might be finished now. And we can move on. But thank you, everyone. That was really helpful. So these are 3 key considerations before we get anywhere near being examined. The really important one, and this is a discussion which will usually include at least someone in a health service, someone in a police service, and someone in social services. And the hope would be that you might be all together in a child house, but you may not. But you still need to collaborate to work to answer these questions for the child. So the key consideration initially is the particular child safe, and are there any other children who might be at risk of harm? The next question is, how urgent is the medical evaluation? And that helps you decide when and how you're going to time the forensic interview. Not all children have a forensic interview, but it's also something that might, you need to just be thinking about it at this initial point. So in terms of safety, if there are other children in a home with a perpetrator, then we need to ensure that they're safe. What we have a lot of in England, a lot of concerns at the moment about other children who might be in the care of a perpetrator in sporting club or school or nursery. We have a lot of issue with gang-related sexual assault, some trafficking, and we've had quite a few big media generating trials recently about young girls being sexually exploited in various cities in England. We have a whole sector in relation to internet crime as well. So in all of those, there's likely to be more than one child who's at risk, and we need to start planning about how we're going to make those children safe as well. So that's an early discussion and planning. And then in terms of the actual medical evaluation, there's an acute medical need very occasionally. There's quite an important forensic consideration, or they might be both together. I know in Resmia's talk, she talked about how evaluating children for physical abuse is often best done in a children's hospital, where if you need to, you have access to pediatric surgeons and operating theatres. It's pretty unusual in sexual abuse or assault, but it does happen, and it is obviously a priority. So if a child has sort of extensive bleeding, the place to take them, unless it's in the same setting, is not a child house that's remote from a hospital, but the place to take that child is an emergency department. And if you're not sure, you should probably go to the emergency department. But if the child appears otherwise well, then the child house or similar setting is the right place to be planning your medical evaluation. I don't want to get too technical about forensic evidence, but there is a consideration there in that if a child or young person is examined in a particular framework which varies according to, 1, your local setting and the local guidelines, 2, the age and pubertal status of the child, and 3, what might have happened, there is a forensic window of somewhere between about 3 days and a week, during which time you have a reasonable but decreasing chance of getting perpetrator DNA from the child or the young person. And so, as long as there's consent and agreement, it might be helpful for that child to be examined in a forensic setting quite promptly. Having said that, though, that is not a priority. The priority is the child or young person. The other thing to consider and to discuss in your initial meeting is the fact that clothing that a child or young person was wearing may provide good forensic evidence, and so the police normally would routinely collect that, but you might want to ask them. And the other thing is that in many settings, and you could inquire about your own setting, there is a thing called, it's got a few names, we call it an early evidence kit, and I'm going to show you one in a minute, but it's just early evidence trying to get the alleged perpetrator's DNA that can be more or less collected on the spot, either by police or by those in the health setting. And obviously, to collect it, you need the consent of the young person, if it's a young person, or a child's carer or non-offending parent. And this is actually from Western Australia. It's just an easy way to remember, and quite a catchy drawing, that basically you need some urine and a gauze wipe of it's for girls, obviously, for the genital area. We also do a mouth swab, or some people do a mouth rinse. So that can be done almost straight away, and already there might be some forensic evidence being collected. But as I said, it is not a priority, but it is a consideration. So moving on. This is the third poll. There's only one to go, and it's quite a lot further on. So this is about where you, in your setting, or where a child would be seen. And you might have more than one answer. And then there's another setting about what determines where a child or young person will be seen. So we'll just see. You may not know, but lots of people are going to. One person is going to a children's hospital. Okay. Specialized center. So the consideration is other. Okay, and the people, I think there's about 11 or so people here. The people who haven't answered, is that because you're not quite sure? Can you text that into the chat thing? Because it would be interesting to know. So I think we've finished that poll. Just going to take it away. Oops. Okay. Thank you very much for that. That was also very helpful. Okay, so just now we're moving on to the actual medical evaluation, and we're going to talk about why would we want to do that. A lot of people, I think, have a view that it's not great for the child or young person, and I'm going to try and dispel that thought. The setting, explaining, which is absolutely important. Consent, which I know there will be variations in who can consent and not consent to this examination. What we actually do in any treatment we provide. The importance of feedback and follow-up. And then obviously health professionals do make a contribution to the medico-legal and child protection processes after these sorts of examinations. Right. So in terms of what can we contribute and why would we want to have a child examined, there is an absolute medical need that only health professionals can really provide in relation to the healthcare needs that a child like this might have, and they're particularly around physical health. So STIs stands for sexually transmitted infections. There may be a risk of those. There may be treatment required in various contexts. For girls who have got to puberty, there is a risk of pregnancy, and there is the opportunity, if they want it, in our setting certainly, for post-exposure prophylaxis for pregnancy and for HIV. And often we need to think quite early on about the mental health, especially of adolescents after a sexual assault, even at the point of the initial medical evaluation. So they're the sort of basic healthcare needs that children and young people have a right to obtain if there are concerns around sexual abuse or assault. In terms of whether or not we do collect any evidence with our early evidence kit and forensic swabs that I talked about a few slides ago, we often don't see any injury, and we often don't have any forensic evidence. And I'll explain the reasons for this a bit later. So I think because of the low yield we get, some of our colleagues in police and social services don't really understand why a medical evaluation is important, and quite often I think they think it's traumatic for the child. And they are right in that we seldom provide evidence. We do see injuries at times, but usually only in the very first little period of time after the actual assault. The best thing we do, in my view, is to provide reassurance, because no matter what's happened, the child or young person and their non-offending parents or carers often have really terrible sort of images of the child being more or less ruined forever or not normal, and how everyone will be able to be aware of this. And the best thing we do at the end of most examinations is to say to the child and the carer, or the young person and the carer, everything is absolutely fine, you're absolutely normal. And you can just see that they start to move forward at that point because of the images they've had in their mind. So I think of all the things we do and of all the reasons to have a medical evaluation, that one is by far the most important. We also, as I've said, we contribute, and in fact our view of what's going on can be important in the safeguarding and medico-legal process. Safeguarding is a word we use in England for child protection quite often. So we've not only examined a child, but we've also got to know the child or young person a bit. We've got to see how they respond and their relationship with their carer. So we sort of can contribute if we have any concerns about anything we observe during the examination period. And it does take, from our initial meeting of the child until we wave them goodbye, it's probably going to be at least 2 to 3 hours. Not all of that is examination, but the whole process takes a little while. So we've got a good period of observation there. Right. So now the setting, and Stefan in his initial talk gave you a very beautiful outline of how important it is. So it needs to be child and young person friendly. These are 2 photos of Barnahus, this one in Iceland, this one in Linköping. I hope I pronounced that correctly. And you can see that they're nice they're nice, they're friendly, they're welcoming, they're not too busy, they're calming. And not only the setting, thank you, Shana, not only the setting, but also the staff are really important. So you have to have staff who are pleasant, they're not rushed, they're child friendly or young person friendly, and they're welcoming. And that's really, really important. We place a great deal of importance on on explaining what's going to happen. This is actually not only to children and young people. In our Holland Haven service, we have people we call crisis workers, and once we've done the welcoming, they sit down and they explain to anyone who's coming to our service what is going to happen. We first of all reassure them they don't have to tell their story of what happened during the assault again. We will get that information from either social work or police. We might have to check a few things, but we are not going to take them through it all over again. We try to explain in an age and developmentally appropriate way what we would like to do. There are children with particular special educational needs are more vulnerable to sexual abuse and assault, so we do see a higher proportion of those than is in the population. We tell them what, because people have all these fears about what might happen, what might be going to happen, we tell them what we would like to do, and we make it clear what is not going to happen. A lot of people think we're going to do an internal examination. We reassure them we are not going to do that. Apart from occasionally in consenting adolescents who are well past puberty, we will only do things with the child and young person's consent, so that they may start off consenting, and we reassure them that if they're not happy about what's happening, they can just tell us to stop and we'll stop. We tell them who'll be in the examination, who'll be with them, because usually they will have someone with them who is quite often the non-offending parent or carer. It might be someone else. Adolescents quite often don't want someone with them. That's fine as well. We tell them who else will be in the room, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And then we sort of go through what would happen after. So before they even start, they've got a pretty good idea, and we take as long as they need to explain this to them about what's going to happen, and how it's only with their consent and they can stop at any time. And just in terms of, because as I said, in our service we have wonderful people called crisis workers. They come from a variety of backgrounds, often nursing or social work or counselling. In our particular service, we've got a completely wonderful person whose title is a family nurse advocate. Some services use play specialists to help with the explaining or do the explaining. I know Resmea a couple of weeks ago mentioned the child life specialist in her service. As well as sort of verbal explaining, you can use various models and props for younger children. Lots of people have nice explanatory leaflets which you can adjust to make them as age appropriate as possible. And what we do a lot is we show children things. So we show them our video imaging equipment, and we let them magnify up their hand or a toy. Before we do a swab, we give them a swab so they can just see it's just like a Q-tip. And so we just try to make it as non-traumatic as possible all the way through. We always obtain consent, and I know that we have a formal consent form which includes each element of the examination. So some parents can consent to, or parent or the young person, if they're able to consent. They can consent to some parts but not others, so they have a bit of control in the examination, which is good for them. We try to encourage even quite young children to be involved in the consent process. A lot of really young children, and we don't get them particularly involved, it has to be said, but certainly once, if they're listening and they want to sign the consent form, even if technically they're not able to, we will definitely encourage them to do that, which is in accordance with the Convention on the Rights of the Child and other frameworks, so we make sure we take the child's view into account. I know in your different settings, the framework around whether or not adolescents can consent and whether their parents must or must not be informed is going to depend on your local setting. In England, adolescents with who are what we call guilt competent can consent. We're not obliged to inform their parents, and there are lots of reasons why that might or might not be a good plan, but sometimes all you need is a bit more time with the adolescent, and eventually working with them, you can get them to involve the various agencies and their parents once they've got a bit more confidence in the system. But we don't have to force them into that. I know in some settings you don't have that choice. Right. So in terms of who should be present, one of the reasons I'm talking about this today is because I am aware that some of our colleagues have a problem, shall we say, with a very large number of people being present during the examination. And so I thought I'd just set out what we do. And how we get over the need to have good cooperation from our police colleagues without actually having them in the examination room. So the people who we would have, obviously the child or the young person, with a support person for the child who will often be the non-offending parent. And as I said, some adolescents may wish to be examined alone, which is fine. And then we have no more than about 3 people, 2 or 3 people, and they're child or young people friendly. We're not in a hurry. We do have luxury of time when we're doing our examinations. And we usually have a mix of doctors, nurses, including our forensic nurse examiners, the crisis workers that I've mentioned. In some settings there are play therapists, and there are various types of advocates. And that's it. We don't bring the police into the room. We have a discussion with the police beforehand. We meet them afterwards. We describe the findings, if there are any, and we hand over the forensic swabs if we've taken them to the police at that point. But we cannot see, I mean, first of all, it's very, for many children, it's the first time anyone's examined their anogenital area. It's a very private examination. The police are not going to know what we're seeing or what we're doing, and it's just inappropriate and potentially extremely traumatizing for a child to have a vast crowd of people in the examination room. So what do we actually do? So sometimes we do this in our setting in the waiting area because it's private, but we take a very comprehensive past history and a history of the current functioning of the child. We do it with a pro forma, which just helps us not to forget things. One of the objections to pro formas is that if you're just sitting there ticking off 100 questions, it can not look as though you're engaging in a appropriate way with the child and the carer. But it is important not to forget things. We also, part of that will be not only physical health, but also mental health and general sort of social functioning. Then we do a general normal examination, because this is something that most children will be familiar with. We do it bit by bit. We don't strip them down and then sort of make them stand around with very few clothes on. So we do an arm, and then we might do the chest, and then we might do the tummy. If we're doing a forensic examination, the child or young person actually wears a disposable hospital gown in our setting, and what we've often done before that is to cut it so that it looks quite fun with a zigzag hem or something a bit amusing for the child. And the reason we do that is because the clothing may have been taken as evidence, and just as an aside, if you're doing that sort of examination and the clothing is going to be taken away, you need a replacement clothing supply for the child or young person. So we do the normal things that pediatricians do, which is height and weight. I forgot to put in here, we assess their pubertal status, and we look for signs of injuries and signs of neglect for things like dental caries, for example. And occasionally children in this context may well be neglected, which might include neglect of their medical needs, so we are looking for signs of unresolved medical needs as well. And as I said, throughout this whole fairly long period, we're looking at their demeanour, their level of understanding, and their interaction with the carer. This is so this is the examination room in Tallinn. This is our examination room in London. This is not a forensic examination room. In Tallinn, I'm not sure actually. But we do explain to the child, and those children who provide consent, we explain that we do need to have a look at their anogenital area. We do it in a way that protects their modesty as much as possible. And depending on the age, little children, we can often do it on their mum's lap. I'll show you a picture of that in a minute. And our aim is to have to use various techniques which are all about sort of just positioning the child and looking at the genital area, anogenital area, so that we can see whether or not there are any injuries there. Oops. So this is a fully dressed child, as you can see, but this is the sort of position we might examine a child in, or we could even get the mum right up on our examination bench. And that way we can see what's going on in the anogenital area, but the child has got the security of being on the mum's lap, basically. I think we made a big mistake when we kept talking about colposcopes in the context of examining children after child sexual abuse. Because colposcopes are used in gynecological settings as well. They are often the same sort of camera, but what they are is a magnifying camera. The way we use it in child sexual abuse examinations is not an internal examination at all, and it doesn't even touch the patient. The benefit it brings, there are two big benefits. One, we will have a recording of any injuries that we find. And two, because we have a recording of images, if we're examining the child and we're not quite sure, because deciding whether findings in the anogenital area, particularly in girls, is quite a specialized skill, and sometimes it's really hard to know whether it's a normal variant or not. So if you have images, it means that you have the possibility to review them with your peers or with experts so that you can reach a more balanced opinion about what you're actually seeing. So it avoids the child being re-examined, and actually it has a great value in terms of educating health professionals who want to be involved in this type of work as well. So that's the way we use it, just as a camera. And basically we usually have one person or the mother holding the child. This child is being super cooperative, but sometimes we don't force children at all, but sometimes we need to hold them or wriggle them around a bit. But we're just using it as a magnifying camera. I'm stressing that because I've come across so many people who think that what we're going to do is an internal examination. So what are we actually looking for? In the anogenital area of boys and girls, we're looking for, if we're examining the child, what we call acutely, that is within a few days of the disclosure or the concern. We're looking for fresh injuries. So we're looking basically for bruises, abrasions, which are like grazes or scratches, and lacerations, which are like cuts. And they can be in any particular part of the genital area. So for boys, they might be on the penis or around the bottom. For girls, they might be anywhere in the genital area. Once we're out of the acute phase, we're looking for signs of old injuries. They are actually very rare because most injuries in this part of the body heal really rapidly. And the expertise that I mentioned a minute ago, the appearance of the genital area, especially in girls, is hugely variable. So there is a wide range of normal appearances. And this, in the end, there is a particular evidence-based book from the Royal College of Paediatric and Child Health in England, as well as AAP and a few other people, which go through all of the normal variants and the significance of various findings that we might see. So it is quite specialized. And the other thing to say is that there are other causes of abnormal appearances in this area. There is trauma that's not related to sexual contact. This is a child having what we call a straddle injury. That is not uncommon. What will normally have happened that will differentiate it, it's not only to some extent the nature of what we will find, but also the fact that people or other children will have observed this child falling with one leg on either side of a bar. So it's a straddle injury. Boys sometimes have zipper injuries and have injuries to their penis. Then this is getting a bit technical, but there's a whole range of medical conditions that are not related to sexual contact. So this is where the expertise in terms of interpreting the findings comes in. And it's also where the value of having the images and being able to discuss with colleagues or experts becomes really valuable. So, and I know people think it's all about the hymen. It's just a definition of the hymen. There is a hold in the middle of the hymen, which some people don't appreciate. If you don't have it, it's a medical problem with that name, imperforate hymen. And out there in the world, I know there are many, many misunderstandings basically about the hymen. But injuries anywhere in the genital area have significance in the context of examining the child who's disclosed sexual assault or abuse. Oops, I'm going to skip over that one because we decided it was a bit too frank. But as I said, for people who are involved in this precise area, there are a range of references at the end which will help you if you need more expertise. So basically, we hardly ever find any abnormality. There is quite a recent paper, it's reference 8 in these references, where depending on how quickly you examine someone, you will find in girls examined within a day or 2 or 3, up to 20% will have an injury, whereas if you wait, very few girls examined after that period will have any sort of injury. And so there are 2 reasons why there is no injury. One is because a lot of abuse is not violent, it's either touching or various things that are slowly developed with the child. And secondly, even if there was an injury there initially, as I said, everything heals really, really quickly. So you absolutely have to stress in any report you're writing that just because you've seen nothing, that's a normal examination, it does absolutely not mean that nothing happened. And this just shows you how quickly things heal. So you can see lots of bruises, abrasions heal quite quickly. Some people do, if the child consents, re-examine children with injuries after a period of time, which can be really helpful practice because it helps you to be more precise about when the injury occurred. Now, I'm running out of time, so I'm going quickly. So this is actually a picture from a Promise 1 meeting, and you might see some familiar faces. But once you finish the examination, you need to discuss with your, especially police and social services, but also education colleagues, what the next steps for the child are going to be. And obviously, you have to take the views of the child into account and then explain that to them. You need to give them their feedback about what further things they might need. Reassure them about injuries healing quickly. There's a whole area of, actually you can't, if a child has been abused yesterday, you can't actually screen for sexually transmitted infections straight away because they won't show up, so you need to give them the advice about that. We regularly collect feedback from, we've got age-appropriate user satisfaction forms for our children and young people and their carers, and their age sort of appropriate so that even the youngest child can give us some feedback. I've already mentioned, so there's reassurance about healing sexually transmitted infections, and then liaison with children's local teams. There is psychological follow-up. This is just a nice picture from the Barnahus images, which I think you've had a talk on that already. And obviously, as I've said, we support medico-legal and social services investigations, and actually everyone gets a bit nervous about going to court, so we support the people going to court as well. Peer review is something that I've mentioned. It is what we call when we are learning from or trying to decide with a group of us about what we're seeing on the video imaging, and it's really good to have access to that, and I'm going to answer a question briefly at the end about that, which is here. So this actually, if you can just type into your chat. So I don't know how many people have good training, especially the health professionals. Do you have good training to the more medical aspects of this examination? It'd be good to know who uses either video or still imaging, although I think the nature of the audience might mean that you don't know. And similarly, if you are in a sort of health occupation, do you have access to peer review? I'm not sure that's going to apply to many people in the audience, so I won't get too bothered about it. But you're going to tell me in a minute. So I just want to really quickly mention, in fact I think I've hardly got time, one, just because they've come up here and there, and there are lots of misconceptions about virginity testing, and there is a problem that you may or may not run into in your setting, which relates to female genital mutilation. So the WHO recently has completely condemned virginity testing, and I know this is still an issue in some parts of the world. It is completely re-traumatizing, and it's totally unscientific. And there is a reference at the end which is a systematic review just demonstrating how unscientific it is. So unless you can get an accurate answer, which you can't, it's just appalling, really. And then these are some nice posters that you can maybe put in your setting, because I think as health professionals or people involved in the area of child sexual abuse, you're really well placed to advocate to stop this practice. And then again, depending on your setting, and certainly this applies in England for sure, depending on either where you are, if you're in this sort of area, or whether you have high levels of immigration from this sort of area, you will have concerns about children and young people who might be subjected to female genital mutilation, which again is recognised as a violation of human rights, and there has been a lot of progress in this area in recent years. So there are the helpful references which you will have access to later, and there is, when I relax from all my work, this is really nice. You can see it's on a nice place in London, not too far from where I live, which is where I go to relax, and you get a great view of the London skyline. So I'm really looking forward to some questions and comments, and let us see what happens next.
Hello, thank you so much for your in-depth presentation, Andrea. I have a first question. We had a participant last time who asked Resmia about to tell us a story about a time that she got it wrong, or I think that was the question anyway. I will ask the same question to you, but I'll also expand it. Maybe since so rarely there is any evidence for sexual abuse, maybe do you have a story about a time where you caught something that would have otherwise gone unnoticed?
Unfortunately, I don't think. I mean, we see a lot of children where no one really knows, and sometimes the parents can find it very distressing that they're actually in a thing called a sexual assault referral centre, and they find that in itself distressing, particularly as sometimes when it's not known, people are very nervous, and so if they go to the emergency room or the general practitioner, everyone sort of treats this child a bit like a hot potato and wants it to get to the next place, which, if it is a sexual assault referral centre, is sort of sending a message to the parents, which can be very upsetting to them. That's one area where, I have had a father who got really angry with me personally because he was so upset about being in a sense like that. And actually I sort of agreed with him it was not sensible that he was in the setting, but there was a concern and no one else in the health context would address it, so we would. The other thing that we find very distressing, and in fact I did discuss this with some of the Promise One team, is we sometimes see children where we think the allegation made by one parent against the other in the context of usually an acrimonious separation, we can find that very upsetting, and we deal with the distressed parent, and I'm not quite sure how well we do that. And we've seen that child and old, they're usually quite young children who are often pre-verbal, so they can't talk, but we have in the last year or so seen an older child who I think had been, I'm not sure, it was hard, this is where it's hard to say, had been really coached by her mother, I think, into sort of describing these horribly graphic events, and we just didn't quite think they were right. So our main distress and concern, and do we get it right, is around where some kind of manipulation, psychological manipulation going on around in the context of an allegation of sexual assault.
Mm. For all of our listeners that are still with us, Katerina has put some more questions to you actually in the chat. We would like to know who uses video or still imaging, if you have access to peer review, and things like this. So if you're still with us, we'd love to hear more about those things in the chat. Andrea, actually, you weren't with us in Razmia's presentation last week, but I know that you've watched it. After watching it, is there anything that you would like to comment on or add here and connect it somehow to your presentation today?
So I think it was very comprehensive, and I totally admired Razmia's capacity to carry on even though the technology was not behaving itself. That was very impressive. I think everything she said was very similar to anything I would have said, actually. I mean, in terms of our centre, the Havens, we are exclusively related to sexual assault and abuse, but in terms of the job at the other hospital I work in, St Mary's, we regularly see children with various degrees of difficulty of physical abuse, and actually, you know, some things are slightly different in one country to another, but it was all of the things that Razmia said I completely agreed with. So no, I thought it was great talk.
I'm actually quite surprised myself to learn that you only, did I understand it correctly, that you only do an internal evaluation on children who have gone beyond puberty?
So there isn't, well, the only time we would have to do an internal examination on a younger child would be in an operating theatre with a sort of an endoscopic sort of instrument, and that would only be if we thought there was sort of quite severe internal injuries or bleeding. But it's just too invasive, and it doesn't give you, you can't do it to a child without an anaesthetic, frankly. And it's just, I don't think there's a practice anywhere to do routine internal vaginal examinations in prepubertal girls. Some people do examine children's bottom. There's no evidence that you get any more information from that. So again, it's the whole ethos of the Barnahus is no re-traumatization. So we would be completely opposed to anything that is traumatic for a child in the context of examination. But I think it is precisely that view that makes us wonder sometimes when the police and social workers think, oh no, we will not put the child through that examination. Because I think everyone thinks, many people think we do something, internal, but we don't. We get our information from looking externally. Except for, once girls get a bit older, if they consent, we would, and if we were concerned, and sometimes there is a view that maybe you can get better forensic swabs, then maybe in that setting, only with consent, then there would be an internal examination.
Before I pass it back on over to Judith to wrap things up from the Child Hub side, is there anything more that you'd like to add?
No, I hope I haven't shocked too many people into, by this talk, but I tried very much to make people feel less nervous about suggesting that a medical evaluation after sexual assault or abuse is actually a good thing for a child. And the most important point I made was actually about the reassurance that we can provide. And actually I think Stefan mentioned this in his first talk. Being reassured that you're normal is hugely, hugely valuable for both the child or young person and the non-offending parent or carer.
Thank you so much. And with that, I would like to pass it on to Judith to wrap things up. Lazar is typing something. And I also want to invite our listeners to subscribe to the newsletter for Promise. There's a link on your screen. You should be able to click it. And thank you once again, Andrea, for joining us and for wrapping up part 3 of this mini webinar series on medical evaluation. I feel like we really got a good look of the basics of everything. And thank you so much for your enthusiasm for expanding it. We originally thought this would be just one webinar, and it turned into 3, and we're so glad for that. So thank you so much. Judith, it is back to you.
Great.
Thank you, and thank you to both of you for this very comprehensive presentation. It is just my duty to invite you to check out our upcoming webinar on violent extremism to resilience. It's December 6th at 3 p.m. And yes, you can see a series of web links in the web link section, so check those out, including ChartHub also has a newsletter, so you may want to subscribe to it to keep updated on upcoming events, webinars, and resources. Thank you very much for being with us. Don't forget to give us feedback on this webinar, and hopefully see you soon.
Bye.